This week we're beginning a new sermon series where we're going to look at the lives of some of Israel and Judah's noteworthy kings. Now, you might think that a king wouldn't be a great place to look for lessons about your life because, of course, kings' lives are so different than our lives. But if you peel away the particulars of their lives, underneath, I think what you see are many of the same struggles and temptations that we face. So I think there's a lot to learn, so let's dive in. Now, this week, I want to look at the first king of Israel, King Saul. But before we dig into Saul's life, I think it's important for us to understand why Saul is there. Why does Israel have a king? So we need to go back and look at a little bit of context. So God promised Abraham that he would give him the promised land, and Abraham's descendants ended up enslaved in Egypt, and Moses came and delivered them from Egypt, brought them to the land of Canaan, and under Joshua, they managed to conquer the land of Canaan. Now, God had told the people that they needed to worship him exclusively, but when the people got into the land, they had a really hard time being faithful to the command that God had given them to be exclusively worshiping him. And so they started worshiping the gods of the nations around them, or incorporating their pagan religious rituals into the worship of God. And so because God forbid this, he allows those people to be punished by the neighbors. They come in and they oppress the people. And when the people realize that they're being oppressed and cry out to God and ask for his help, God sends a judge, a military deliverer, to fight off this invading force. And the people are then restored to faithfulness, but usually only for the remainder of the judge's life. And then once the judge passes on, they go back to their old way of doing things. Eventually, God does something different. Rather than appointing a judge, a military ruler, he appoints a prophet, a spiritual leader, and that prophet is Samuel. And by all accounts, Samuel does a good job leading Israel. But as he gets old, the Israelites have questions about who is going to succeed him, and so they start to clamor for a king. We read this in 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9. So the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." So the people assume that their decentralization, they really are sort of functioning as just sort of a loosely federated group of tribes, that decentralization is making them easy picking to their neighbors. And they think that a king who will be able to marshal all of the people's economic and military power will actually defend them against these other nations and help them to stand up for themselves. And that may be true on one level, but it doesn't leave a lot of space for God to meet them, and also having a king is going to create some problems even as it solves others. And so God gives the people what they want. He wants to show them, if you get the thing that you want, it's not necessarily going to work out the way that you assume it will. And so the first king that God picks for the people is the king that they want. In that time and place in the ancient Near East, when people were looking for kings, they wanted a physically impressive specimen, the tallest, the strongest, the biggest, the most handsome man. And on that front, Saul checks all the boxes. He's a head taller than everybody. He's handsome. He's from a well-connected family. Saul even starts out looking humble when Samuel goes to announce that Saul will be the king. Saul is off hiding in the baggage. He's intimidated, and so should he be. He's only a young man, about 30, and he's been tasked with leading a country that doesn't have a history of political union and they're in a constant state of low-grade conflict with their neighbors. He doesn't have a constitution laying out his rights and his responsibilities, so he doesn't know how that dynamic is going to develop. He has no succession plan. And all of this makes it a nearly impossible task. That's kind of the point. Saul can't do this on his own, but he is meant to find strength and wisdom from God. But that's not how it goes. Saul's uncertainty leads him to insecurity rather than humility. You see, a humble person knows they don't have what it takes to get the job done, and the solution then is to admit to other people what they can't do and ask for help. So I'm a terrible carpenter. And so if I decided I was going to repair the deck at my house, I could just watch some YouTube videos and figure out I'll get it done myself. But that's going to end disastrously. If I really want to get a good job, then I should hire a professional, or at least, to ask a friend to help me who actually knows what they're doing. We see this kind of humility in David. David, who says that the Lord is his shepherd. He understands where his strength comes from. But we don't see this with Saul. Saul doesn't genuinely seek the Lord in everything. Rather, Saul allows his uncertainty to become insecurity. An insecure person knows that they don't have it within themselves to do what they need to do, but they cannot find the humility to admit that to other people. They don't feel safe doing that. And so they try to compensate for that sense of inadequacy through bluster, through bravado, and by deceiving themselves, trying to accomplish stuff that they believe will help them to get over their sense of inadequacy. We see no record in the Old Testament of Saul genuinely seeking the Lord. Instead, he just sort of seeks him in sort of self-serving ways. Saul's insecurities are laid bare when Israel is attacked by a numerically superior force of Philistines. We read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting in verse 5. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that the army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all his troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal. And Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offering." And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. Now Saul is the king, and he has broad authority. But Saul would know that he does not have the authority to offer the sacrifices. God has split the political and the spiritual track of authority. We see this, for example, with Moses having the political power and Aaron having the spiritual power. The king is not allowed to offer the sacrifices. That is reserved for the priests who are the descendants of Aaron. Now, when Saul offers the sacrifice, I don't think it's a genuine plea to God for help. Rather, he sees that his army has become demoralized. The army is looking for some sign that God is on their side, and he's willing to provide that by offering the offerings himself. Then the army will feel like, oh, God is on our side, and now we can be strengthened. But he's not actually seeking God's help. He's giving in to the worries of the people under him. Now, immediately after he's offered these sacrifices, Samuel arrives. He's horrified at what Saul has done, and he lays out the consequences, starting in verse 10, just picking up where we left off. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to meet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." So when Samuel says your kingdom will not endure, what he's saying is, Saul, you are not going to have a dynasty that follows after you. You assume that your son, Jonathan, your eldest son, is going to succeed you on the throne, but he's not going to. Now, in the ancient Near East, especially when you were just starting a monarchy, a dynasty was of critical importance. Because when you left, whether you were assassinated or died of natural causes, and somebody who wasn't your family succeeded to the throne, the most logical thing for them to do would be to eliminate your entire family, because your family has a claim to the throne. And so by getting rid of you, they're getting rid of the greatest potential rival for authority. Now, in a culture that values the continuation of your line above almost anything, that's why people are so bummed when they can't have children, this feels like sort of a death sentence to Saul. It is important, however, to note that God is more merciful than Saul expects. Because while God has said that he will not have a dynasty, the person that he anoints as the successor, David, is merciful in ways that a successor might not be. David refuses to kill Saul on numerous occasions. When part of Israel goes under Saul's son Ishbosheth for a period of time, and then Ishbosheth is assassinated, David doesn't reward the assassins, rather he has them put to death because he says it was not okay for them to do that. And the one person who has the best claim to the throne after that is Mephibosheth. And rather than killing Mephibosheth as a rival, David brings him into his household and extends kindness to him. Another story that we see that lays out Saul's insecurity is the story of David and Goliath. Now, Goliath is a giant. We're not really sure how tall. Some manuscripts say that he's 6 cubits and a handspan, which would be 9'9". Others say he's 4 cubits and a handspan, which would be 6'9". I'm inclined to think it's probably the 6'9", but whatever. In 6'9", and today is a very tall person. 6'9" back then, when a lack of nutrition tended to stunt people's growth, was a towering giant. But you know who else is a giant? Saul. He's a head taller than everybody. He is the champion that the Israelites are looking to. This is what he has been put in place for. This is why they want the tall, strong guy as their king, to be their champion. But where is Saul? Is he out meeting Goliath's challenge? No, he's hiding in the tent. He's chicken. And David comes and says, well, I'll do it, even though he's just a little shepherd boy. Saul says, oh, you can wear my armor when you do it. And I think the reason is if David actually does manage to defeat Goliath while he's wearing the king's armor, the people who viewed the battle from some distance away might be convinced it was, in fact, Saul that defeated Goliath. But David doesn't take the armor. Instead, he goes out so that everyone can see it's just the little boy, not the king who's supposed to be their champion, who defeats Goliath in the name of God. And of course, this sets Saul's insecurity on overdrive. And this kind of brings us to another problem that we see with Saul. Saul sets his will against God's will, but in the process, even interprets God's will as if it is his own. Even though God has said, you are not going to have a dynasty, he tries to kill the person that God has said will replace him. He even tries to invoke God's help to off David. First, he sends David on what he assumes is going to be a suicide mission after a bunch of Philistine foreskins as a bridal price to marry his daughter. When that doesn't work, he takes a more hands-on approach, trying to hunt down and kill David. And as David flees, he goes to the priests at Nob, who are unaware that Saul is trying to kill David, and he asks them to help him. And they gladly do so, assuming that he's on a mission for the king. And when Saul finds out, he actually goes and slaughters the king, or the priests of the Lord, because they helped out David in good faith. His idea of what is right and wrong has become so twisted by his insecurities and by his desire to pursue an agenda that's apart from what God has wanted from him. It's so twisted that he actually sees God's hand trying to help him achieve that. There's a scene where David goes and hides in a city, and Saul here's a report that David is in a walled city, and it says, this is 1 Samuel 23:7, God has delivered him into my hands, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. God has delivered him into my hands. He's still deceiving himself enough that he can actually believe that God has orchestrated the death of David, even though it is Saul who is acting treacherously towards David, not the other way around. But of course, David gets away because God is protecting him. And as David goes into exile, Saul and his three eldest sons die tragically in a battle against the Philistines. And after a period of reshuffling, David comes out as the king. So what can we learn from Saul's life? Well, insecurity led Saul to doubt God's faithfulness. And because he doubted God's faithfulness, he tried to fix things himself when he was meant to seek help from God. His army was inferior, yes, but his God was superior. And so he should have relied that God could have miraculously saved the army. Of course, there are stories in the history, mostly of the kings of Judah, where God does exactly that. For instance, Hezekiah refuses to surrender to the king of Assyria, and God wipes out the Assyrian army that threatens to surround and besiege Jerusalem. If he had chosen to believe in God, despite the long odds that his army seemed to be up against, it would have given Saul a sense that God was trustworthy. So when you trust God and he proves himself faithful, the next time it's easier to trust God. And so it becomes a sort of virtuous cycle where you trust God because he's proven himself faithful, and then you keep trusting him more as he reveals himself to be faithful over and over again. But it means choosing to trust God when it's not comfortable to do so. And sometimes we are given the opportunity to trust God, and we don't. Maybe you got called by God. You feel a sense that you're supposed to do something, but you chicken out because you feel like you're inadequate for the job. Well, Saul was called to do a job that he was not adequate for, but he was meant to rely on God, and so might it be in your case. Maybe the thing that you say no to God to do is actually the thing that God wants you to do so that you can learn that he's faithful. But if you choose to do what is right and good, if you choose to follow, you'll have that to look back on. I know before I went to seminary full-time, Carolyn and I had discussed it, and it seemed like a foolhardy thing to do because financially didn't know how we were going to pull it off. I was afraid we were going to lose our house. But God proved himself to be faithful. And now I have that, and I can look back at that. The next time God asks me to do something that pulls me to trust him so much because it's taking me out of my comfort zone. And so as we learn to trust God, we grow deeper in faith, but we only grow deeper in faith when we trust beyond what we're comfortable with. Something else we see here is that we can also interpret our will as God's will. I mean, in an absurd case, you might have a thief praying that God would help him get away with this heist, or a philandering husband praying that God would help him properly cover his tracks so that his wife doesn't find out about his infidelity. But usually we're more subtle about it. Usually it comes down to idolatry. You see, there are things in our lives that we look to for ultimate satisfaction. We might not consciously realize that's what we're doing, but we act as if this thing can finally make me feel like I'm at peace. So if I think that it's just like, if I could just get that resume where I've accomplished all these things, if I can just do this and this and this, then I'll finally feel like I'm worthy. And so we try. Or if I think that if I can just marry the most attractive spouse, that I'll finally feel like I'm worthy. Or if if I can just have that house. When we look for ultimate satisfaction in things in this world, even things that are good, what we are doing is idolatry. We are looking for a form of salvation, but we're looking to things that can never save us. And sometimes if we don't identify that that's what we're doing, then we often try to invoke God's help in achieving those things. Oh God, help me to get this or that, and then I'll feel satisfied. And God's saying, no, you won't, my child. That thing can never make you feel satisfied. That is not what salvation truly is. Salvation is when you find out that everything that you need in this life and in the life to come comes from my hand. And so seeking me and my righteousness and my kingdom is what gives you salvation, not having these things that are just offering empty promises. So let's not ask God to aid us in our pursuits of idols. So Saul is asked to do a difficult job, and he begins with promise. He's aware that he can't do it alone, but he allows his insecurity or his uncertainty to metastasize into a toxic insecurity. He's too scared to admit that he needs help. And so he looks to himself rather than to God, and that sends him down a disastrous path. Like Saul, we have a hard job to do too. And when things are hard, how do we respond? Do we humble ourselves before God? Or do we bluster and try and convince ourselves that everything's fine? Do we try to do it in our own strength, to be enough? If this is our approach, I'm afraid to say that it is bound to be unfruitful and futile. Or, like Saul, we can deceive ourselves into looking to God to deliver on our agenda rather than his, invoking his help in furthering our idolatry. But instead, we have the opportunity to understand that even though God's agenda is not the thing that seems most desirable to us at any particular moment, that in the end, it is the thing that leads us to life. And so if we seek salvation from the things around us, we're going to be frustrated. But if we submit ourselves to God and his will in our lives, there we will find life. So let us not make the same mistakes that Saul makes. Instead, let us humble ourselves and seek God's will.